Hello and welcome to the Elevate 2021 Identifying and Remediating the Unsupported Features of PowerServer 2021. I'm Chris Pollock from Appian, and I'll be doing this presentation. You can reach me by email at chris.pollock@appian.com. You can also reach me via LinkedIn at the URL below. I started with PowerBuilder Alpha 0.8 way back in 1989. And that's because I used to work with Mr. Dave Litwack, the original designer of PowerBuilder and InfoMaker, and Mr. Kim Sheffield, the original designer and author of the data window and InfoMaker's report painter. In 1991, I started my own consulting firm, and I did a lot of mega projects with PowerBuilder, InfoMaker, and PowerServer since 2008. We're talking mega projects in the database in the petabytes, applications that have 10,000 plus concurrent users. In 2016, I joined Appian as the Director of Developer Relations, responsible for developer liaison, fundamentals, courses, technical presentations, and various support roles. As you can see here under key skills, I have lots of PowerBuilder, PowerServer, and InfoMaker experiences. Prior to that, I was a database administrator, information resource management director, and data administration management as well. I've worked on lots of Windows programming internals, almost every database management system out there, lots of programming experience, not only with PowerBuilder, but most languages out there. And my forte today is systems, technical, and application architectures. So what are we going to cover in this particular session? Generating the Unsupported Features Analysis Report, new PowerScript commands, unsupported features that can be detected, unsupported features that cannot be detected, discrepancies that cannot be detected, and tips on troubleshooting and debugging. So how do we get the UFA report? Open the application painter, then select Additional Properties. Select the PowerServer tab, and then select the UFA report checkbox. Here you can see the actual Additional Properties dialog. PowerServer is a tab page. The second one is checkbox, which is during compilation, report unsupported PowerScript features for PowerServer deployment. But here's a tip. You don't need to go through a deployment or compilation of PowerServer. As soon as this checkbox is done and you save the application object, just perform a full build and you'll see this report in the output area of the IDE. And it looks something like that. This report was run against my order entry example application built from my own framework, which is available on SourceForge for free. You can see here that one of the first things is it flagged was the SQL return data, because that is unsupported by PowerServer in SQL CA. The next thing is the actual UL sync object, which of course is MobiLink, which PowerServer does not support that Sybase feature. So execution detection, new PowerScript commands. Is it a PowerBuilder application? This says it's a native client-server application executable, compiled using either 32-bit or 64-bit P code, or it's a 32-bit machine code. Is PowerServer client application? Again, that is a native client-server application. The only difference is it's actually being deployed using the Power Client feature, which means it's being deployed from a web server. Is it a PowerServer app? Again, now in PowerServer 2021, it is a native client-server application, just that it's being deployed from the web server, but data access is being done through PowerServer, not by the actual client application. So you can check the particular status. Here's a splash screen example. In my order entry application from the framework, this is the code that I have. If it's a PB app, show PowerBuilder. If it's Power Client, show Power Client, which you can see on the left-hand side in the splash screen, Power Client version at the bottom of that. Or if it's a PowerServer app, then write the text PowerServer. And that's what gets driven into the splash screen. There's a new compilation directive, #disable UFA. And you can see here that between the #begin and the #end, if you encounter any command that's not supported, for example, the setTrans object is supported, but setTrans is not in PowerServer, it's not going to write that to the UFA report because of the #begin, #end compilation directive. So using the online help. PowerServer's help file is available in the IDE. You'll see it in the actual new PowerServer project painter, and it's an icon on the right-hand side that launches the built-in help file. However, these are static by release, so they don't get updated until a new release of PowerServer PowerBuilder IDE is released. However, the PowerServer online help, that's being constantly upgraded by the Appian documentation team, and it's available here at docs.appian.com PS2021. And if I actually click on that, it'll launch my favorite Firefox web browser, and you can see here that we're into the actual PowerServer 2021. So notice here you can actually go through and you can read all the different things about how to install it, requirements, quick start, how-to guidelines, and this is being updated constantly, so it's always up to date. So notice that the PowerServer 2021 maintenance release, which was released in November of 2021, has added a few more unsupported features. So again, the online documentation is the most up-to-date. Note that the PowerServer online help from the PowerServer built-in help file is also available. So here's a little tip. Right at the bottom it says accessing the online help. Then you notice the link there, PowerServer online help, and it'll take you again to that docs.appian.com PS2021. So there's a fast way to get to it if you don't remember the URL. So let's have a look at unsupported features that can be detected. Set trans can be, of course. That means that you want to work in pseudo-conversational mode. That means between every database transaction, PowerBuilder does a connect and then a disconnect. The key is the connect-disconnect sequence on every conversation to and from the DBMS. However, this is not supported, so when this comes up, you'll have to convert your application from the old method to using the new setTrans object, which does not do pseudo-conversational. It does conversational. That means as soon as you're connected, you stay connected until the application decides to actually disconnect from the DBMS. Remember, however, in PowerServer, this connection and disconnection is not a big overhead because PowerServer itself is the one connecting and disconnecting to the database management system. All your application is doing is logical connects and disconnect. PowerServer maintains a physical connection all the time and uses application pooling, which uses database connection pooling, which speeds up the whole process. Data pipeline is not supported, but you can create a data pipeline in an independent PowerBuilder application executable. The help says, however, you can call the data pipeline application exe from your PowerServer application. I'm not sure that's good advice because, again, you're deploying that to the client. That means database drivers have to be installed on the client. That kind of defeats the whole use of using PowerServer, in my opinion. However, this is a Chris Pollock's suggestion. Call the data pipeline app from a trigger or store procedure on your database management server. Insert a record into a table, for example, and then have the trigger automatically to run the data pipeline on the actual DBMS server. Mobilink. So one of the suggestions it has in the online documentation is to use the data pipeline. So create a Mobilink independent PowerBuilder application, and then just like the data pipeline itself, call that from the actual PowerServer application. Well, again, why would you do that on the client? You're going to have database client drivers installed on the client. But that's what the online documentation says. But Chris Pollock's suggestion would be to actually take the Mobilink application, put it on the database management server, insert a row into a table that fires a trigger, then it runs the Mobilink application on the server where you have all the DB client software installed anyway for PowerServer. So continuing on, Oracle Remote Procedure Call Arrays. Specific data types. Data types have a limited use within this particular RPC within PowerServer. So the suggestion is to convert all data types to a string array and use a string instead of that particular data type array. For example, number or decimal is one example. As a workaround, use varchar to replace both the in and out parameters on your store procedure. Concatenate multiple values with a separator. An example here is the input parameter here is 123 semicolon 456. So that represents two input parameters, all concatenated the values in between. The store procedure will now parse out the multiple values and put them in the appropriate variable. Same thing on return. If the store procedure returns you an answer, you can parse that answer out as well, that everything between the semicolons is a different value for a different PowerBuilder instance variable. SQL Preview. The event only supports the preview select type, so very limited use. No support for preview insert, delete, or update. So notice that there is planned support for these extra events in the next PowerServer release, 2022. SQL return data property. You saw that it got flagged in the unsupported feature analysis report on my order entry demo application. Used by store procedures to return data to the client. No workaround at this time. Although Chris Pollock would suggest, why don't you actually just have the store procedure return a result set with that information in the result set? That can be processed. Just not the value of SQL return data in the SQL communications area. So PowerBuilder libraries that contain data windows with the same name. It's wrong in the help. It says it cannot be detected. However, PowerServer project will detect this during a deploy. So you can ignore that documentation. It's wrong in the static documentation, but it's now been corrected online. An error message is actually put in the output area of the IDE. You can see this one here. I purposely put a data window in two different PowerBuilder libraries and automatically flagged the fact that DW_department was a duplicate between the two PowerBuilder libraries. In the original release, build 1288, you see the error as documented in the above dialog. However, in build 1311, which is the first maintenance release, notice that there's a new tab page in the output area. It says unsupported data windows, and that's where the duplicates are done. So have a look at, depending on which build of PowerServer and PowerBuilder you have, it does report duplicate data windows. So unsupported features that cannot be detected. Transaction trace, where you say, for example, SQL communications area.dbms equals, and then use the trace keyword in front of the database driver. You can use the PowerServer logs that running under debug mode to actually trace the SQL. So notice if you read in the documentation on PowerServer, you can actually run the server in debug mode, and you can see all the SQL. Another thing is if you're connecting from PowerServer to the database management system via ODBC, you can turn on SQL tracing right at the ODBC layer. Retrieve as needed. It says that this cannot be detected. However, logically, all you need to do is search your PowerBuilder library, your target, for a data window source where the value retrieve.asNeeded equal to yes. And you'll see all the data windows doing that kind of a search that have this particular unsupported feature. So you can actually detect it before you actually get into unit testing. Consider adding a where clause to retrieve the data as needed, for example. For example, use the select top command, or you can use the order by offset. So let's have a look at an example of those. For example, select the top 20 from member form where the row number is over 10. So it's easy to get the next 20 rows starting from row number 11. On the bottom one, the example would be select columns from whatever table, offset n rows, fetch the next m rows. For example, do offset 100 rows, fetch the next 100 would get you rows 101 through 200. Again, this is planned to be detected in PowerServer 2022. So you can get all these features automatically detected, and you'll actually get a message in the unsupported features analysis report. That's pretty easy to do as far as the retrieve is needed, but it will be nice to have the other ones indicated as well in 2022. So continuing on, rows to disk. It says that you cannot detect that, but again, it's easy to do. Just do a global search, looking for a data window object where the key syntax in the data window source is data.storage equal to disk. As soon as you see that, you know that's not supported. Embedded SQL. Store procedures in a cursor can only use a single result set. So you can't use MARS, multiple active result sets, that we do in PowerBuilder, for example, when dealing with Microsoft SQL Server. Different transactions working on the same temp table. That's not supported. And set library list and add to library list may not work properly because you're basically adding clusters of objects and data window objects that have not gone through the pre-compilation process. So their SQL has not been converted to a RESTful API. So it doesn't make sense to use these commands anymore, only in a PowerServer application. Data window name containing special characters such as a dash. You can use the actual search, and now the advanced search in the upcoming 2022 of PowerBuilder, where you can actually use some kind of a pattern match. But again, the key is anything that has a dash in it. So if you look at the example here, if I just do a search in PowerBuilder IDE, just looking for a dash, where I'm looking just for the checkbox control name, it'll pump out all the data window objects that have a dash versus an underscore. Object names using the C# reserve words. For example, abstract, base, and delegate. However, that's really not a problem, because as long as you add a prefix or suffix to those names, they're not detected. It's the same thing in PowerBuilder. You can't use a PowerScript reserve word, such as open or close. But you can say, for example, an object name CB_open. Well, that's not a problem, because again, you use the open keyword, but the prefix allows the compiler to compile it okay. Same thing in PowerBuilder for ages. You cannot use a DML reserve word. For example, in SQL, you have select, you have ordered, you have where. Well, but you can put, for example, a command button called CB_where. That's not a problem, and it won't create a compile issue. So the same thing with C# reserve words. For example, command button CB_delegate is not a problem. It's not a reserve word because you hyphenated it. If you only use a singular type of that name, like the word delegate only with no prefix or suffix. So syntax from SQL does not support stored procedures and functions. It is planned for support in later versions of PowerServer. At this point, we don't have an actual release that I can actually say this is going to happen in this particular release, but it is coming. Database synonyms are unsupported. For example, if you modify PowerScript to call a C# assembly or REST API directly. So commit or rollback transactions using dynamic SQL. Well, obviously you don't want to do that because PowerServer is doing the commit rollback management. So make sure that you let PowerServer do that, not the dynamic SQL. For example, you don't want to say execute immediate commit, that because there may be a commit in progress done by PowerServer. So it's just going to confuse the whole situation in interacting with the database management system. So again, you notice here that the dynamic SQL, however, is planned to be detected at least in PowerServer 2022. Continuing on, data retrieval and SQL operations in the retrieve row event cannot be detected. So again, the retrieve row event code is not supported. All PowerScript is ignored when the actual compile is done for building the client-side application. However, Chris Pollock workaround here, develop a PowerBuilder application using the library directory and library export commands. Search exported object source for the retrieve row event, looking for a data window controller, data store. Pretty easy to do by parsing the source code. And then introspect that for the presence of PowerScript code attached to those events, the retrieve row. If so, you've got a little utility that will do that. By the way, a lot of these things that are not detected, I've already put in my suggestion there as an enhancement for PowerServer 2022, saying to the engineering team that really these things can be detected. So I think you will see a lot more of that coming in PowerServer 2022 and short releases thereof. So again, you notice that the retrieve row event is planned to be detected in 2022, but you can detect it with your own utility here in 2021. Another thing, database connection. Each active transaction uses a database connection. You have to remember, of course, that the connection is not done from your client application. It's done from PowerServer, the middle tier. So the middle tier is the one responsible for the physical connections and when those physical connections get released. In between, basically your application is just doing logical processing. Alias names, syntax from SQL. An alias name is the same as the column name. And then you need to check if the correct column name is used in a join. Notice that PowerBuilder uses the table underscore column name. that when you use two or more tables. PowerServer will just use the primary name emp ID. Data type mismatching. Here you have a data type that is corrected in the database, but the PowerServer data window is not yet regenerated because there's no automatic regeneration at this point. So for example, your application thinks it's data type X. PowerServer understands that the data type is going to be Y. So at runtime, PowerBuilder will throw an error, while PowerServer will retrieve the data successfully. So the problem, of course, is when PowerServer bundles it all up, puts it into a JSON result set, and then the client application has to unbundle that JSON data stream, is going to realize in the data window buffer that a column ABC, which was data type X, is now Y, and then of course you'll get the actual runtime error. But that's as easy to fix. Just go ahead and rebuild and deploy PowerServer, and that'll match everything because it'll check the current database schema and realign all the data types. Rows updated value. Notice that this is an argument of the update end event. It returns 1 in PowerBuilder, and it will return 0 in PowerServer. Disable bind. The value 0 is the default, which means don't use that. A disable bind of 1 means disable the SQL bind feature. If this is the case, disable bind, which is the default 0, PowerBuilder will throw an error because a column cannot be null. However, in PowerServer, it ignores that and will process the row successfully. Table blob feature. Table blob control selects a text field for retrieval. PowerBuilder retrieves the data for all columns except for this blob. PowerServer retrieves no data whatsoever. So this is a pretty hard one to find. Now, of course, if you have the table blob, it's not used too often. So obviously, when you actually don't get any data presented on the screen, that's probably something obvious within unit testing, where you have to say, hey, let's go back and have a look at the table blob mapping and see what it actually manages it to an actual binary large object column, such as var binary, or is it actually mapped to a column of type text, for example, in ASE or SQL Server, which of course is not quite the same as a binary blob. Dynamic data windows on computed fields. PowerBuilder will use computed expression as the column title. PowerServer will give it a name, for example, compute2. It doesn't use the actual column name _t, for example. You will have mapping issues on the dynamic data window, but that will result in an error on unit testing, so you should be able to find that. The transaction object name. Transaction objects, of course, are defined within the actual PowerBuilder application as instance variables or global variables, or the built-in one, SQLCA. However, when it becomes an argument to a function, PowerServer will use a transaction object name as the argument to the function to look for the mapping in the database cache area. So transaction objects defined as an argument, PowerServer will use a different transaction object name. So here's the example here, where you have a function, ofconnect. It's passing an argument called atr_trans_object. And that's what the actual PowerServer mapping will look for. Maybe this is just a pointer, and it points to, of course, the real SQLCA. So you have to watch out for that. You may have to retrofit a few of these commands. The data type in a dynamic SQL or format for SQL statement. In PowerBuilder, the Oracle database may return a number, for example, a decimal data type. In PowerServer, the Oracle database may return a numeric value instead, which is a long. So in a dynamic situation, how do you actually figure that out at runtime? Just add a choose case. For example, SQL descriptor area, SQLDA.output parm type, and then of course this is an array. So you can check, for example, is the one coming back in that particular array of 1, 2, 3, 4, whichever the argument is it a type long? And then you can make the appropriate processing determination at that point. So a decimal data type in static SQL or the data window. PowerServer returns numeric data with a fixed decimal point according to the decimal precision of the column. If the decimal place is insufficient, however, then a 0 will be automatically added. PowerBuilder, of course, won't do that. It'll 0 fill it up to the decimal point. Store procedure parameter. If PowerBuilder does not pass the output parameter, then the store procedure can still use the default value to successfully get data. In PowerServer, of course, the output parameter is not passed, and then PowerServer will use a null instead as the default value. So again, you should find this in unit testing. And this also drives home the point through this whole presentation, is that you have to be very careful doing proper unit testing when you're going from a native client-server application to PowerServer. And then, of course, the cursor syntax as well. If a database cursor is running and it has redundant statements, PowerServer will consider it as a parameter and will display the error. PowerBuilder will just process the database cursor. No ifs, ands, or buts. Transaction commit. If the commit statement is executed after the transaction object, SQL CA, for example, autocommit equal to true, then PowerServer will display the error at execution time because it wants to do the commits. So PowerBuilder will not err at this point. The database client driver attached to the PowerBuilder application will handle it. The timing of a transaction rollback. Select statement is executed after an update statement, but the update is successful, whereas the SQL select is not. PowerServer will immediately roll back the entire transaction and roll back the update, for example, because the select fails. Well, that's usually not a problem. I don't know too many applications that do an update and then a select. PowerBuilder will not do this. It'll allow the select to go through. If it fails, you're going to get some kind of a, for example, plus 100. Data is not available. And you make the determination in the application of when to actually do the commit. Oracle and autocommit and lock. So the Oracle autocommit and lock properties take effect in PowerServer, but will have no effect in PowerBuilder. So if you have an unsupported isolation level, for example, RU or read uncommitted, PowerServer will throw an error executing the SQL. Syntax checked after a union. Notice that PowerBuilder does not check the syntax after the union keyword. I had to look this up. I had forgotten all about that. So if you have an SQL statement, of course, in PowerBuilder or a data window object, when you do a compile, PowerBuilder sends the SQL statement over to the SQL or DML preprocessor with a no execute. And then it actually checks that syntax. Notice that PowerBuilder doesn't send the entire syntax. It stops at the union keyword. So it only checks the first part of the union. PowerServer, for example, when it actually compiles and executes, it actually checks all the syntax, including the SQL after the union operator. So actually PowerBuilder should do that. That's maybe an enhancement suggestion here. Use the describe in a dynamic SQL format 4. You cannot use a describe when you're doing format 4 SQL. Bit data field. PowerServer does not support the bit data field or data type. Neither does PowerBuilder, but you can get around this, for example, in ASE or Microsoft SQL Server by setting the disable bind equal to yes. So it allows you to actually determine a 0 or 1. Where the bit data type, there is no bit data in PowerBuilder. Column order in a data source and column specification. If the columns in the data source and the data window specification are not the same, the data retrieval will fail in PowerServer, where if it doesn't in PowerBuilder. So that's a tricky one because all you're doing is changing the actual column order within the SQL statement. So notice in PowerServer, column order is sensitive. In PowerBuilder, it's not. Select blob and update blob supports only the UTF encoding. In recent versions of PowerBuilder, it uses the encoding UTF-16 little endian. In the select blob and PowerServer cannot correctly display the value is probably because it's expecting it only in UTF-8. So for example, if you do a select, that you're going to have to make sure that you do an actual blob command brackets around that data so you convert it from 16LE to UTF-8. Otherwise, it won't work. And that has to be done for the JSON data stream to return the result set in JSON format. SQL n rows within a database cursor. Notice that PowerServer fetches all data rows at once. So SQL n rows will be the amount of rows fetched from that actual SQL and where clause. Whereas PowerBuilder fetches one row at a time. So there's definitely a discrepancy here. SQL code properly within a stored procedure. If the stored procedure returns a result set with 0 rows, the SQL return code is -1 in PowerServer, whereas in PowerBuilder, the return code would be a +100, which is the ANSI standard, by the way. So PowerServer itself, for example, is a little non-standard in this respect. But you'll have to now say, for example, if this is a PowerServer application and SQL code is set to -1, then there is no data to display. Column name from a view. Notice that in SQL from a view, PowerBuilder and PowerServer will generate different column names. So of course this could be an issue because what happens now is you have some kind of set item right after the actual retrieve, and the column names don't match the column names in the data window object versus the SQL result set. Editing SQL. If you manually type a logical keyword and or into the SQL select painter, PowerServer conversion and data retrieval will error. So to resolve this is a sort of a workaround at this point until I fix this bug. Notice here is the SQL painter. You're used to actually typing in on the right-hand side, and or. Don't do that. Otherwise, it's not going to generate SQL for PowerServer in the RESTful web service. Instead, when you click in the box under Logical, select the value and or from the dropdown. Don't type it in. So, tips on debugging and troubleshooting. So again, there's no debugger in the current version of PowerServer 2021, even the maintenance release build 1311. So without the debugger, you're going to have a tougher time to locate application issues. Try to use the PowerBuilder native debugger to debug your PowerServer curve as much as possible before you actually deploy the PowerServer application. Use MessageBox command to alert the PowerBuilder developer of issues. Use the OS event log to actually log debugging information. Use the application logging to log debugging information. Or use the actual operating system debugging log to debugging information. However, notice that the last 3 points are not supported in native PowerBuilder. The good news on a couple of respects. Notice at the top here, a comprehensive debugger is planned for PowerBuilder PowerServer 2022. In fact, for those of you who actually saw my keynote address on the new features coming up in 2022, I actually demonstrated the new integrated debugger which works on PowerServer application right from within the IDE's debugger. Now, what about those last 3 things? OS event, application, and debug log. Well, notice that there is the capability here to actually write to the actual OS log. For example, you can see in this message, start a PowerServer application, and it actually gave you the handle. You can put the name and the user, whatever that you want to write into that log. You can also do it in your application. You can actually write and build your own log. And then you also have the ability here to actually write to the operating system debug log. Notice in order to view that, you have to use the Microsoft System Internals viewer. But you can download this viewer free from the Microsoft site. Notice if you look at the actual command, it says call, in this case, the application controller to actually write to the debug log. So in my framework, I have the ability here to actually write to the debug log, the normal log, or to the operating system log by using this OF write and then a variation of that in my framework. Again, this is the framework available on SourceForge. It's free and you can use whatever code you like. So if you download that framework, please feel free to take the code from those OF write events within the application controller and put that into your own application if you don't want to use my entire framework. And then you'll be able to then write to the OS log, the application log, and now the OS debug log. The debug log is actually really useful, even if you're going to go to PowerServer 2022, because sometimes you need to actually debug things. And the debugger gets a little unstable, for example, if you're constantly going through activate and deactivate or focus and lose focus. You can actually cause other problems because you create like a cascading failure. However, if you use the Microsoft debug log, you can actually write all sorts of stuff through those sensitive events by not using the PowerBuilder debugger. You can see everything in the debug viewer and you don't disturb the actual execution of the application by introducing basically redundant recursive failures within the debugger. So what I'm saying here, for example, is when this happens, then the application and the debugger crashed. So by using the sysinternals log, you don't have that. So there's a Chris Pollock tip for today. So don't forget that Appian is available on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and of course, the Appian community website, where there's lots of great discussions, articles, videos, training, and lots more. So thank you for watching. At the end of this session, we're going to have a real-time question and answer section. So stay tuned at the end of this presentation and be prepared with your questions, and I'll see if I can answer them for you.